come here. Hopefully the rest of you are on Zoom, and welcome to you as well. This is the second session on the bankruptcy of Detroit. Before I reintroduce our speaker, I have a couple announcements. Remember to silence your cell phones. We all know about that. And as I said, welcome to the Zoom participants. We have a monthly program coming up on Tuesday, March 7 at 9:30 at the Jack Miller Center. The speaker will be Ron Bogle, brother of HAS member Gary Bogle. He's the president and CEO of the National Design Alliance, a not-for-profit organization focused on supporting cities and schools through change and transformation. His presentation is titled Reimagining America's Schools, Designing for the 21st Century. Coffee and cookies will begin at 9 a.m. So hopefully the weather will be better and you'll be able to make it there. So today, as I said, we'll have the second installment of the Detroit bankruptcy. Our speaker is my son, Stephen Hackney. For those of you who were here last time or those on Zoom, it was definitely interesting to find out some of the precursors for what happened in Detroit population-wise that contributed to the city having to face bankruptcy. And that's something that other cities in the US may face in the future as well. So welcome to our speaker, Stephen Hackney, as he tells us a little more about the bankruptcy.
Thanks so much. It's great to be back with you and to see everyone here, especially when it's so icy out. So thank you for coming out. I thought we would briefly go back through some of the highlights of the first class and then talk about what we're going to cover today, just as a brief refresher. So in the first class, we talked briefly about the history of Detroit, its rise and its decline. And we also got an introduction to bankruptcy principles and also to principles that are unique to municipal bankruptcies. Municipal bankruptcies are quite unusual in American history. There have been a relatively limited number of them, and Detroit's bankruptcy is the largest ever by a large measure in terms of the amount of debt. The only other municipal bankruptcy like Detroit's would be Orange County, California, filed for bankruptcy. And then we talked about the appointment of the emergency manager, Kevin Orr, and I'm going to return to that briefly at the start today. In our class today, we're going to get a little bit more into the bankruptcy itself. So this will be a little bit more technical, but hopefully at the right level of generality. We're going to talk about who Detroit's creditors are, whether Detroit was eligible for Chapter 9 protection, which is the first step in a bankruptcy case for a municipality. We're going to talk about the grand bargain. That is the centerpiece of the Detroit bankruptcy. The most famous part of the Detroit bankruptcy is the grand bargain and how it figured into the city's plan of adjustment. And then we're going to talk about the confirmation trial that happens at the end of a bankruptcy case. So you have to be eligible to get into bankruptcy, and you have to be able to confirm your plan to get out of bankruptcy. Those are the two key parts of a municipal bankruptcy. So in our first class, we talked about the meteoric rise of the city of Detroit. Don't forget that even in the 19th century, from 1850 to 1900, you saw a tenfold increase in the population of the city of Detroit, driven in large part by the Erie Canal and the ability of people to now move from the coast into the interior of the country. You saw a staggering growth, obviously, from 1900 to 1950. The city's population increased ninefold during that time. And that was fueled principally by industrialization and the automotive industry in Detroit. And then you saw a pretty stark decline over the back half of the 20th century. And the statistic that I can't get out of my mind is this gap right here, where the city loses 25% of its population in just 10 years from 2000 to 2010. It's the largest decline of any city in the United States with more than 100,000 people in any 10-year period, with the exception of New Orleans after Katrina. So it gives you a sense of what Detroit was facing. So the keys to the rise of Detroit, its location, the Erie Canal, the rise of transportation in the United States generally, including the railroads, the innovation and industrialization that followed Henry Ford's introduction of the assembly line, and also the Great Migration. The fact that we didn't have slavery in the North and they did in the South meant that many Black folk went from South to the North, meant that many northern cities, including my home city of Chicago now, were beneficiaries of that internal migration. And then the decline, deindustrialization, racial strife, and white flight. Detroit goes from being 50-50 Black and white in the early 70s to being 90% Black by 2000. Competition in the automotive industry, mainly from Japan, and then also reverse migration within the United States as now people move from the industrialized North, from the unionized North to the non-union South in pursuit of jobs. I wanted to go back a little bit. This got covered in a bit of a rush at the end, but this emergency manager law is a relatively big part of the story in Detroit. They first tried to pass it by referendum in November of 2012, and the unions successfully mobilized their members to defeat the referendum. So what the legislature did is they took the same law, and let me just take a step back. The way the emergency manager law works is that if your city is adjudged to be in financial distress, the governor has the right to appoint a financial review board. If that financial review board determines the existence of probable financial stress, the governor can then appoint an emergency manager. And the reason that's so significant is the emergency manager displaces your elected representatives. So the city council of the city of Detroit, the mayor of the city of Detroit, they are now shunted to the side, and the emergency manager becomes the czar of the city of Detroit. So this was extremely controversial. And what they did after the referendum was defeated was they added an appropriations provision to the emergency manager law. So they added a provision that said, oh, we're going to have these emergency managers, and so we need to appropriate funds to pay them. And they appropriated about $5 million for the city of Detroit, not just for its emergency manager, but also for the law firm they knew they were going to have to hire to handle the bankruptcy. And that's significant because if you add an appropriations provision to a law in Michigan, it exempts it from the referendum. So now it doesn't go back to referendum. It's just passed by the legislature and signed by the governor in January. And Kevin Orr is appointed 2 months later. And I think I said in the beginning, you can imagine how fraught this political question was of appointing an emergency manager to be the head of the city of Detroit. So you have a largely white legislature, you have a white governor, you have your largest city is 90% Black. You're about to push aside all of the elected representatives of that city in favor of this person that you're going to appoint. Making that selection is going to be an important choice for Governor Snyder. So when Jones Day, a national law firm, comes in to pitch for the case and says, hey, we'd like to be your bankruptcy counsel if you file for bankruptcy. And we just happened to have brought with us one of the leading bankruptcy practitioners in the country who is African-American. You can imagine what Governor Snyder thought when he saw that pitch team. And he thought, this is my guy. And Jones Day was thinking that as well when they brought him along, because they thought, if you like our partner to be the emergency manager, I'll bet there's a good chance you're going to like our firm to be your law firm. So that was good strategy by Jones Day. So Kevin is appointed on March 14th, 2013, and he cuts his video after he's appointed that I thought I would show you so you can get a sense of what he's like and try to understand what position he was in coming into this role. So let's see if I can get this to play.
I love Detroit. My uncle, when I first came up here to go to school, we didn't have enough funds for me to do school trips. So I came to University of Michigan sight unseen, except when I was a kid. My mother got her master's here. And my uncle picked me up from the airport and took me around Detroit. I stayed with him that night and then brought me to school. And for the years that I was here in school, from 1976 to 1983, we would regularly go into Detroit, whether it's Greektown, whether it's Hamtramck, whether it's the Riverfront, Cobo Hall, Joe Louis Arena, whatever, for events.
So loud as it'll go.
Detroit has a
Great.
special fondness in my life, even when Sparky Anderson was fighting for a pennant back with the Tigers. So I have been affiliated with Detroit physically in mind and spirit for the majority of my life, from 1976, and personally, having done the Chrysler case, we heard a lot of the same sort of things we're hearing now. It's never going to work. In fact, some of the senior executives of the company were of the strong opinion that no one would ever buy a car from a bankrupt automaker. The reality is that company, as well as GM, as well as Ford, are going away gangbusters. They have great products. They're expanding. Market share year over year is growing. So I see Detroit, in a sense, as being an opportunity to bring that kind of growth and that kind of renaissance, excuse the pun, the Renaissance Center, to the city. If we can do this right, this is the Motor City. This is a city that gave us Motown. This is the city that during the World War II was the arsenal of democracy. Okay? This city changed the way we live. It gave us automobiles, which allowed us to commute. It gave us a new way of listening to music. It is a historical city of record in the history of this country. We have to do this. This is a great American city, and we have to get this city on the right track. Well, I hope my relationship with the people of Detroit will become a very close one in a very short time frame. I hope the people of Detroit view me as both a change agent, but also someone who can span the citizenry of Detroit. I've been reading some of the press clippings about what is soon to be my prior job as a corporate attorney at a large corporate law firm. And I hope people recognize, at core, I'm still that young kid who grew up in the tomato fields of Broward County, Florida, and spent my summers on the red clay streets of Altamont Springs at my granddaddy's church, the great Reverend Eugene Jasper Owa, as we say in the South. And that I have not lost reflection of the arc of my life to where I am now from where I came from. So being that being the reality of the matter, I hope the people of Detroit recognize I can sit in any room with anyone and empathize with where they are. That ability hopefully will inform decisions I make, or at least allow me to communicate across all strata. I would like to think of myself as having the capacity to bring Detroit together truly, in that sense, as long as we're operating in good faith. We're America. We sent people to the moon. We built the Hoover Dam. We can do anything we want to do if we operate in good faith. I've been a member of a number of progressive organizations throughout my professional career. I'm a lifelong Democrat. I participated in voter protection both for John Kerry and President Obama. Voting rights, obviously, coming from the South. My grandmother was born in 1898. She walked the Seaboard Coastline Railroad tracks every day, back and forth, rain or shine, hot or cold, to her job. And the one thing she did until she died at 85 was to vote. So in a very real sense to me, she had an 8th grade education, but in a very real sense to me, the issues of depriving people of their voting rights or representative voice resonates with me. However, we are a country of laws, not of men. The role that I'm undertaking is a creature of state statute and has been long-standing. And the concepts of reorganization, conservatorship, receivership, trusteeship have existed since good King George began granting tariffs and commissions in the colony. So while I understand there's a lot of concern and emotion behind the concept that I'm depriving people of certain rights, actually it's very consistent with both the history of the country and in specific in this state. Emergency managers laws have existed in their current iteration from 1980, which has been almost over 30 years, or from the act that I'm going to be appointed under, 1990, for almost 25 years. I would hope that people recognize that in the state, both behind Democratic governors and Republican governors, emergency managers have been appointed in 5 cities and 4 school districts. So this is, while unusual and of concern, it's very common, and it's long-standing. I'd say my top priority is, getting boots on the ground, and if you excuse the mixed metaphor, in the saddle, and get to the data. I've obviously been trying to get briefed as best I can on sort of the status, and I've been drinking through a fire hose with a number of different information, but I'd really like to verify the information impressions I have. There are some issues, principally due with delivering services to the consumers and customers of the city, the citizens, that I'd like to get to, and whether that's lighting, enhance public safety and security, enhance EMT response times, things along those lines. That frankly would be my first priority. Number one, is there a financial emergency? Everyone says yes, even the people who hate to admit it. Number two, should something be done about it? Everyone says yes. So the third prong of the issue is, what are we going to do about it? Or I'm the conduit, I am the tool to do something about it. So for the people of Detroit, what they should expect is, I'm going to try to apply, the governor says relentless positive action. I just say I'm going to work through the data. I'm going to try to make reasoned, rational decisions based upon the facts, based upon the need and the current realities on the ground, which everyone admits and agrees needs to have something done about it. And if I can do that, people of Detroit should expect reasoned, fact-based decision-making based on the data. I will try to be empathetic to the real-world consequences of any decision I make. That's my goal. But the decisions are going to be driven by externalities and realities that exist and everybody agrees to.
So you can see Orr's political strategy here, right? Like, and I should say, Ian, there will be other videos. So Orr's political strategy, he recognizes how fraught the situation is that he is coming into. He recognizes that there are concerns about depriving people of their democratic voice. There are concerns about race. So he comes in and says, look, I am a Black man. I am someone who understands the Black experience in America. I'm someone who grew up poor. I'm not just a rich corporate lawyer, but I have sophistication. I have facility with bankruptcy law, so I can talk to, I can handle the financial creditors, but I can talk to the regular folks. And he also speaks directly to the political concerns about people being deprived. So I thought, very thoughtful pitch by Kevin. I would ultimately end up deposing him 3 times in the case. So we got to know each other a little bit. And in one of the nicer moments in the case, my mom actually came in before we were going to go to court the next day and receive one of the many defeats that I suffered in the city of Detroit case. And my partner went over. It turned out that Kevin Orr and the rest of the Jones Day team were at the same restaurant we were at. And so my partner, without me knowing it, went over to Kevin Orr and said, hey, if you want to have some fun, Hackney is over there with his mom. And so Kevin Orr and the lead bankruptcy counsel for the city of Detroit got up and came over and introduced themselves to my mom. So they're very classy guys. And I had a great deal of admiration for him. I'll show you, I think, the key fingerprint that you can see on the city's approach to this, that while I don't know who it comes from, I attribute to Kevin Orr, but we'll get to that in a second. When you're talking about bankruptcy, there's this old saying, right? You can't follow the game if you don't know who the players are, right? So the players in a bankruptcy are the creditors, okay? So you got to figure out to whom do we owe money? Now, I want to stop real quick and remind you that in a municipal bankruptcy, there is another player in the game, and that's the citizens of the city, okay? But the citizens may not be creditors. In fact, they're probably people that owe the city money, if anything, through taxes. But that's a very different element of the game from a Chapter 11 corporate bankruptcy. In a corporate bankruptcy, you really only care about the creditors, or the only people you have to deal with. In a municipal bankruptcy, you now have these citizens who are out there. They have a vested interest in how is this city going to operate going forward. And I'm going to tie this up for you in a second, but I wanted to go through some of these different creditor classes so that you understand what this stuff is. You'll commonly see that Detroit filed for bankruptcy with $18 billion in debt. And that's correct as far as it goes. But the first type of debt, the sewer bonds, are a very, very different type of debt. They are secured debt. Do you remember in our first class when we talked about the difference between a secured interest and an unsecured interest? So the most classic example, right, is when you buy your home, you often use debt financing from a bank. the bank gives you 80% of the money and you bring 20% of the money, and together that's the purchase price of your home. The bank takes a secured interest in that home. Okay, so you are the equity payment, you own the equity in the home, but all that debt that's owed to the bank, that comes first. So if you were to fall into financial trouble and liquidate your home, the first dollars go to the bank. And then if there's anything left over, that's when equity gets a recovery. Okay, so secured creditors come first in bankruptcy. And you can take an added step and say, after secured creditors come unsecured creditors like me, and then comes equity in a regular bankruptcy. So the sewer bonds, when you build a school or if you build a sewer system, you use what's called project financing. So you issue debt if you're a municipality, and you promise the buyers of that debt, the people that purchase your bonds, that give you money to build your sewer system, that they'll get a secured interest in your sewer system. And what that means is that if you enter financial difficulty like this and have to go into bankruptcy, you have to figure out what the value of their collateral is and then pay them the value of their collateral. So you have to figure out how to value the sewer system of a city. And the way this ultimately got handled, this was a very sensitive issue in Detroit, because Detroit, being so close to the Detroit River, it provides water to all of these communities outside of Detroit as well. It all goes through the DWSD, the Detroit Water and Sewer Department. And there was some thinking that by creditors like me, can we turn this into a way to make money for the city by gouging all of the surrounding municipalities and charging them for water? But you can't under state law, because you can only, these utilities can only charge people the actual cost of providing water. So the ability of trying to deprive people of water didn't end up going very far. And one of the things that made that particularly controversial was there were many, many, many people in Detroit that were not paying their water bills. So you don't pay your water bill, but they were still getting water. And so you have all this bad debt in the water and sewer department. And so the way they make up the bad debt is jacking up the rates. So the rates were already quite elevated, and many of the suburban county cities were complaining that, hey, we're paying elevated water rates because your delinquency rates in the city are so high, you're passing on the costs of that non-payment to us. So this was a very controversial issue. There was all this thinking about how we might be able to get money out of it. And the way it all ends is the sewer bonds get paid in full. So they just kind of ride through this bankruptcy and are not a big part of the story. They're the guys that got 100 cents on the dollar and live to tell the tale. So you won't hear me talking about the sewer bonds again today because they won. These next 5 categories of debt. So if we take that $6 billion out, we're down to around $12.5 billion in debt. Half of that is what we call OPEB. Okay, OPEB is other post-employment benefits. These are largely healthcare benefits that you give to your workers and retirees as part of your collective bargaining agreements. So you enter into a collective bargaining agreement with your union. You agree to pay them a pension that will provide them certain benefits in retirement, but you also agree to provide them very good healthcare benefits. Now, this is very important because healthcare benefits, OPEB, other post-employment benefits outside of pensions are not protected by the Michigan Constitution. Okay, so you can adjust OPEB in theory outside of a bankruptcy. The OPEB number was a massive number. And one of the things you have to understand about the OPEB number is it's what's called a present value. So I want you to picture all of the people in this room and picture the cost of providing them healthcare for the next 30 years. Since you all look quite healthy to me, I expect to see you 30 years from now. You would come up, you can imagine how complex that is, right? The first thing is you would take my mom, Fran, and you would try to estimate how much are we going to have to pay to cover Fran's medical bills this year? And then you realize, well, that's just this year. Then we have the next year and the next year and the next year. So for all 30 years, right? So if you think about that amount that you'll owe in 30 years, let's say it's $1,000, okay? What you know is that you need to have $1,000 30 years from now. That doesn't mean you have to have $1,000 today, right? What you need today is something less than that, because you know you'll be able to take that amount and invest it and get a return on it. And it will grow to be $1,000 if you estimate the return correctly, so that when Fran comes in year 30 for her healthcare benefits, you'll have her $1,000. So that present value amount is a smaller amount that anticipates the growth of that fund over the 30-year period. Now, this gets very complicated because, of course, we're not just doing it for Fran, we're doing it for tens of thousands of people. And we're estimating how much it'll cost to provide them healthcare benefits. And that's also complex because healthcare benefits increase every year, right? So this is a fabulously complex analysis. What you do then is when you take that future stream of payments, your estimate of it, and then collapse it back in today, you get the present value of all of those future payments. And that was a stunning number. It was $5.7 billion is how much Detroit was going to need to stack up in a big pile in order to be able to cover all of the healthcare benefits it had promised to all of its current workers and its retirees. So OPEB was a big deal in amount. The next number you have is the unfunded pension liability. Now, this is a similar precept, right? Which is, I've entered into a collective bargaining agreement. Let's say you're all a member of the union. Your union is negotiated with the city on your behalf, and it's bargained for this pension. The pension benefits are going to be defined likely by a contract and likely by how much money you earned. And there are formulas for this that often say, for example, in my dad's case, he was a state of Michigan employee. And I think what it said is, you take the average of the last 3 years of his employment, and then you take 60% of that amount. And that was my dad's pension. And I bring up my dad's pension because my mom is still living on my dad's pension. It's an important part of her financial health. And I was very aware of the significance of a pension to people that had earned it, because that was a core part of the bargain that my dad had entered into when he agreed to be a lawyer for the state of Michigan. He didn't make as much money as people in private practice make, but one of the benefits that he got was a pension. And so that was a core part of the economic bargain. It was a core part of the economic bargain for people that work for the city of Detroit. Now, the problem, right, is on the other side, you have this defined amount that you're going to have to pay people. Now you also have to estimate that, because you have to estimate, well, how many people are in the plan and how many people will be alive and how long will they live. And there are also cost of living adjustments that they had agreed to. So that meant that whatever amount might have been fixed by your pension initially, it would grow by a cost of living adjustment. So there are a lot of analyses that go into this. But the most important part to understand is that when it comes to the benefits that we're going to pay, they're set by contract. The city knows that as the city know, I'm going to have to take care of all of your pensions as you go through life. And so what I do is I set money aside to be able to cover the pensions. But now I have to make a very important determination. And that determination is, how much money am I going to earn on this money that I've set aside? What rate of return will I get? Okay, so if I assume that I'll make a 20% rate of return, which has never happened for any long-term analysis in history, but let's say that I did. I said, we're just going to be genius hedge fund types that are going to make 20%. Well, then a small amount of money will grow fabulously large over the next 50 years if you're earning a 20% rate of return. And you will likely have plenty of money to pay for all of your pensions. But if you only earn a 2% rate of return, then you're likely going to be way short of what you need to pay your pensions. That means the city's going to have to put in lots of money. So this assumed rate of return on your pensions is everything. And let me just give you a sense of it. So the pension funds, as they entered bankruptcy, were assuming an 8% rate of return. And there had been a general consensus in the pension industry that 8% was too aggressive. Remember, if you assume a too high a rate of return and you're wrong, all you're doing is misleading yourself, okay? Because you're saying, I'll do so great, I'll get 8%, I'll get 8%, and you're not. But the pensioners are still showing up saying, I want my defined formula payout. That's like a hammer, okay? That's not tied in any way to your market returns. You owe what you owe. So you really want to get this estimated rate of return correct. Now, it's important on the other side too. If you assume too conservative a rate of return and you say, even though equities in the United States can safely be assumed to return if you have a diversified portfolio 6%, but I'm going to assume 2%. Well, then your projections are going to come in well below what you need to pay all the pensioners, and you're going to have to fill that hole. And every dollar you're taking to fill a hole in the pension trust is a dollar you're taking away from police, fire, lighting, accounting, all these things that go into paying for a city. So getting this just right is what we call an intergenerational equity problem. If you are too generous with your assumed rate of return, you're going to fool yourself and you're going to end up leaving your pension trusts insolvent. If you're too conservative, you're going to end up sucking money out of the city's budget, trying to fill up this pension trust, and it's going to end up having too much money in it that you won't be able to get back. But an 8% rate of return, just to give you a sense of how dramatic, if you reduced 8% assumed rate of return to 7.5% rate of return, the city's unfunded pension liability goes up by $1 billion. Okay. And if there's one thing I'd like to convey to you in this class, whether it's about municipalities or their budgets or finances, the most important concept that I have to convey is the importance of time. Okay. When you take any concept in finance and apply it over a long period of time, the numbers that pop out of it are absolutely dramatic. Okay. So we'll come back to this unfunded pension liability, but when Kevin dug into the numbers, the first thing he said is this 8% rate of return is garbage. So you've been assuming a too high a rate of return. A real rate of return, I think he came up with, was 6.75%. And the unions all went, whoa, because that meant their unfunded pension liability was $3.5 billion. Okay, so if you're the union and you're thinking, wow, we're now apparently unfunded to the tune of $3.5 billion, that's a concern because you know that they're going to be cutting you based on what they think they can afford, and you're worried they're going to make steeper cuts to your pensions. And we're going to come back to the strategy of the unions in a second. Then you have the COPS, okay, the pension obligation certificates of participation. Now, the great irony of this is I was the lawyer for the COPS, okay, which was super confusing because there are also policemen in the case that are called COPS, and the police and firefighters union was involved. So I was the COPS, but then there were actually cops in the case. And so people would get confused all the time when I said I represented the COPS. The COPS were a much maligned, very creative transaction that was entered into in 2004 and 2005. And the funny thing about this is that for me, the bankruptcy was dominated by the COPS. And there was a big trial early on in the bankruptcy that I was very involved in. And I was the villain of the bankruptcy. And there was all this exciting stuff about the COPS. But the problem is the COPS are like so complicated. I could probably teach a 2-part class just on the COPS. So what I've done is I've tried to just streamline it to a couple minutes and see if I can explain this simply. But back in 2004, everyone agreed that the pension trusts were underfunded by $1.4 billion. Okay, now remember that your assumed rate of return is 8%. Okay, so if you are $1.4 billion short on how much you think you need to pay all your pension benefits, that's $1.4 billion every year that you're not getting 8% on. Okay, so you're implicitly losing 8% of $1.4 billion every year because that's what you're assuming you would make if you had that money. So it's a core part of your projection of how much you'll have. And since you admit you don't have it, you also admit you're not getting that 8%. And 8% on $1.4 billion is about $110 million a year in interest income. So Wall Street came to Kwame Kilpatrick and said, we have an idea for you. Let's sell bonds to people that will plug the pension hole, and the bonds will be at an interest rate of 5%. So you'll have to pay interest on the bonds, but the interest will only be 5% instead of this 8% that you're implicitly losing every year. And you'll save the difference of that 3%. And on $1.4 billion, that's almost $45 million a year. That's a lot of policemen and real cops. Now, there was one problem. There is a statute in the city of Detroit that limits the amount of debt the city can take. It's called the debt ceiling statute, and the city was at the debt ceiling. So it could not just directly issue bonds. It had to come up with a workaround. So the workaround was the city created 2 service corporations, which were just pieces of paper that had directors appointed to them. And the service corporation's job was to go find funding for the pension hole. So the service corporations issued the bonds, and Detroit agreed to pay an amount to the service corporations that they would then pay to the bondholders that was the same as if Detroit had just issued the bond. Okay. So you're basically saying, well, this is not a debt of the city of Detroit. The city of Detroit is entering into a contract with the service corporations where it's agreed to pay them an amount of money over time to provide the service of finding people who will give us money, which sure sounds like the city of Detroit is borrowing money. But because it's not debt of the city, it's a contractual annual obligation. It doesn't violate the debt ceiling. And they found a law firm to give an opinion that said this is satisfactory under state law. And they found an insurer, 2 of them actually, to insure these bonds. And that was my client. So my client provided the insurance on these bonds. You have to understand that 2004 was classic, like loose money in the United States. So it's Alan Greenspan. You have very low interest rates. There's money chasing yield. And so that's why people said, yeah, sure, I'll buy these bonds. Looks good. You're over your debt ceiling. That's okay. We'll run it through the service corporations and it'll all be good. Yeah. No, Jones Day would never give this opinion. The law firm is like some law firm I've never heard of that probably had 2 people at it. And that's how they sold $1.4 billion in bonds. And my client insured 20% of those bonds. FIGIC was the Federal Guarantee Insurance Corporation was the one that the Financial Guarantee Insurance Corporation insured 80%. Okay, so you're going to hear a lot about the cops, okay? Because obviously the cops are the guys that are standing there saying, hey, you know, we're owed money too. And everybody's like, your bonds are illegal and we are not paying back these illegal bonds. So we were on our back foot. You also have general obligation bonds, and these are a classic form of municipal finance. All of the cities that you've ever lived in have issued general obligation bonds. They are often secured in part by property taxes, but they're largely unsecured, and they are just backed by the city's promise to pay, the full faith and credit of the city. And you may remember from our first class that revenue sharing had been changed to Detroit's disadvantage, and the state had taken $732 million in amounts that would have otherwise gone to the city of Detroit. and Detroit's operating deficits cumulatively were about $700 million at the time it filed. It had to fund those operating deficits. Like, you can't just say, hey, I'll pay you next week. You actually have to have the cash by issuing bonds. And so the general obligation bonds were the types of bonds that it did issue. Now, I want you to stop for a second and think about this like a bankruptcy lawyer would, and think about what your strategy is going to be. Okay, so if you represent the pensioners, what's your strategy? If you represent the bonds, what's your strategy? And I'll let you ponder that a little bit, but we'll come back to it. Okay, now I'm going to show you how this is how a trial lawyer looks at a statute. Okay, so this is the provision of the bankruptcy code that relates to eligibility. Okay, so when I'm getting ready to try a case, the first question I ask is, what do I need to prove? And the statute tells me what I need to prove. And the other key thing I want to know is, where are the ands and where are the ors in the statute? Okay, so the first words I'm looking for are the word and or. So there's an and here, okay, and then there's an or here. Okay, so I have to prove, if I'm the city, I have to prove 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And to satisfy 5, I have to approve either A, B, C, or D. Okay. So let's take a look through this real quick and see where the problem's going to be. I think I'm going to be able to prove that Detroit is a municipality. I have to prove that it is specifically authorized in its capacity as a municipality or by name to be a debtor under Chapter 9 by state law, or by a governmental officer or organization empowered by state law to authorize such entity to be a debtor. So I'm going to have to defend that emergency manager law and the governor's authorization of a bankruptcy filing. I'm going to have to prove that I'm insolvent. Now, I'm going to be able to prove that because Detroit is not paying its OPEB, and it also declines to pay the cops $40 million right before the bankruptcy. I have to prove that we'd like to adjust our debts, and I think I'll be able to prove that. And then I've got to prove either that I've gotten the creditors to agree, a majority of the creditors, or that I've negotiated in good faith and I couldn't get their agreement, or that I'm unable to negotiate because it's impracticable, or that I'm worried that the creditors are going to try to transfer money away. And this one doesn't really apply. Okay, so this is the legal skeleton that applies to the eligibility fight. Okay, so when the city files, it's the first step it's going to have to prove is it's going to have to prove it's eligible for bankruptcy. So you file first, and then you have to prove eligibility. If you don't establish eligibility, your bankruptcy case is dismissed. Okay. Okay, so here's what happens in the run-up to bankruptcy. And I have to laugh. This case came to consume my life, absolutely consume my life. I was in the newspapers a lot, and I was definitely under certain amounts of pressure from the judges in that case. And it all started for me because I ran into my bankruptcy partner in April of 2013, and he said they just passed this crazy emergency manager law in Michigan, and the emergency manager says that under it, he can do whatever he wants. And that's how I got involved in the city of Detroit case. But as we came down to the end, the city made a proposal to creditors on June 14, 2013. Kevin had every creditor into a big meeting. I think it was at the airport. And they said, here's what we're going to do. We are going to just give you guys all this strange bond that we're going to issue where you're all going to get about 10 cents on the dollar. And it's going to be very painful for everybody. I'm going to treat all the unsecured creditors the same. And by the way, that's important. Keep your eye on that concept. And also, by the way, I just want to let you cops guys in the back know I'm not paying you $40 million today, even though that's scheduled to be paid. So I'm missing an interest payment. So we were not happy. So 3 weeks after that, I wrote a letter to US Bank and I said, hey, they didn't pay our interest. So their pledge of casino revenues, which are about 10% of the city's budget that run through this lockbox, you need to close that lockbox and shut off that money. And this was a key part to our strategy. We were going to try to deprive the city of the access to these casino revenues, force them to do a settlement with us and try to get a better settlement off that leverage. And it failed spectacularly. And then more importantly, on the day of the bankruptcy filing, the retirement systems ran down to Lansing and filed a lawsuit that said, restrain the governor from filing this bankruptcy. And in one of the funnier moments of the bankruptcy, they're all in court, and it is before Judge Rosemary Aquilina. She's a state court appointed judge. The retirement systems have their motion for a TRO, and they're saying, enter the order. So they call the attorney general, who represents the governor, and they say, we've gotten this lawsuit in. Please come over to court. We need to hear what arguments you're going to make against the TRO. And the attorney general's office said, we'll send someone right away. And then I think the person walked over to court like this. And so everyone is like, where is this guy? Where is this guy? Where is this guy? And what they didn't know was Jones Day and the city were hammering away on their papers as fast as possible. And they filed them at 4:06 p.m. And then the lawyer got to court at 4:15 p.m. and he said, oh, bad news. We've already filed for bankruptcy. Your TRO is too late. So it was one of the dirty tricks of the case that I thought was pretty funny. That judge was super pissed. And the attorney general's office said, no, we didn't slow walk over there. We got over there as fast as we could. And everybody's like, yeah, I was born at night, but I wasn't born last night. So they slowed them down long enough to get those papers on file, and the city filed. Now, I want to show you the presentation that they made in the proposal to creditors, because I thought it contained a very important value statement about what they believed that was very intriguing to me. So I hope you can see this, but this is a 10-year projection of the city's financial future. And this is what they laid out to us at that meeting. So this is, they said, here's what we're talking about. So at the top here, the main thing that you can think about up here at the top is this is how much money they think is going to come in. These are their total projection of revenues. And look, it's a pretty, fair projection, right? You're talking about a little bit over $1 billion in total revenue in 2014, and it kind of sags down a little bit over time. So this wasn't some pie in the sky projection. It also wasn't a doomsday projection. It seemed like a fair projection. And then you've got certain revenue initiatives that they think are going to bring in money if they can improve things. And then you've got the operating expenditures. You got to pay people to run the city. Okay. And there are some additional operating expenditures. And then what pops out is your operating surplus. Okay. So 2014, you're going to have 366 million left over. 2015, you're going to have 347 million. Now, look at this next box right here. This next box is reinvestment expenditures that they want to make. Okay, so they're going to make capital investments in the city. They're going to address blight. Do you remember we talked about the fact that there are 78,000 abandoned buildings in the city of Detroit? It costs $10,000 for every single one of those things to demolish them. Okay, so every abandoned house you can imagine in the city of Detroit, and there are 78,000 of them, you can imagine taking a stack of $10,000 bills and putting it on the front porch. Okay, it is a shockingly expensive thing to remedy. Look how much money they've got for this. They're going to spend $500 million knocking down houses in the city of Detroit. They have a defined contribution, pension contribution. Now, do you remember when we were talking earlier today about how you fund pensions? The pensions are defined by contract. That's a defined benefit. This is a clear signal that they're going to junk the pensions and they're going to replace them with a defined contribution. And defined contribution are much more safer, much predictable, because defined contribution says, I, the city, will put this much money away for all of you fine people. And when you need money, whatever is there is what you'll get. So if it does really well, you'll get that. If it does really poorly, it won't. But I'm going to take the uncertainty out of it, of that mismatch of having a contractually defined amount that I owe Fran, but pension assets that aren't performing that well and are now out of whack. Defined contribution fixes that problem and just says, whatever I put in is what you guys will get out. And we're going to have a negotiation about how much I'm going to put in. So that's a hugely significant line item right here. If you're a pensioner, you're like, whoa, I don't like that at all. I like my defined benefit pension. And then there were certain other aspects here. Okay, so now they're like, okay, so we've got $107 million this year, $121 million next year, left over for legacy liabilities. Okay, now you got my attention because I'm one of your legacy liabilities. How much do you have left over for me? Oh, well, bad news, because we got to pay our secured creditors. Remember, they come first, okay? So here are the elements of certain of their debt, and I should say the sewer debt isn't in here, but parts of their debt are secured, and that takes $77 million. So what they've got left over is $30 million. Okay. Over time, they're saying over the next 10 years, we've got about $800 million. Now, you remember when we were looking at how much they owed $12 billion, and they're saying we've got about $800 million. So that 10%, 10 cents on the dollar number they were offering is right around, you can see where this comes from. But the reason I spent so much time on this is because this box here about reinvestment in the city was a value statement by Kevin Orr. It was a value statement that we are going to invest in the city first, in upping services in the city. And then after that is what's available for you creditors. Now, remember we talked about bankruptcy is democracy. To get out of bankruptcy, you got to find people that are going to vote in favor of your plan. And you know who doesn't vote? The citizens. They're not creditors. They're not going to be in a class of creditors that's going to get a vote on the plan. So I always thought this was a very bold statement by Kevin Orr that, well, you know what? I'm just telling you, Detroit is on its back foot. It needs all the help we can get. And so we are going to invest in the city of Detroit, and you all need to accept that. So it was fascinating to see this statement of value here. And this concept made its way all the way into the plan, the idea that there needed to be reinvestment in the city. And what I thought was so smart about it was undeniable. When you were in the city of Detroit, you could not argue with a straight face that the city didn't require massive reinvestment. It did, just at a basic level of humanity. But legally, it is not obvious that a city can use a bankruptcy proceeding to improve services, right? If you're a creditor, you're like, hey, the city's a city. If it sucks to live in Detroit, then it sucks to live in Detroit. You owe me money. And so this idea of like, well, wait a second, what level of services should we provide? What are we obligated to provide? What would we like to provide, right? Well, of course, you'd like to throw money at the city and its citizens. They're the voters. If you're the mayor and the city council, you don't care about the financial creditors. You want to take care of the voters, right? But in bankruptcy, you got to worry about the voters like me. So there's this tension there between trying to take care of your creditors and make them happy, take care of the citizens and do right by them. Okay, here's Governor Snyder.
Today, I authorized the emergency manager for the city of Detroit to seek federal bankruptcy protection. This was a difficult and painful decision, but I believe there were no other viable options. Why did I do this? What's the rationale and what's the impact for both the city of Detroit and the state of Michigan? Well, let me start with the fact that this is a situation that's been 60 years in the making in terms of the decline of Detroit. From a financial point of view, let me be blunt. Detroit's broke. It's been spending 38 cents on the dollar towards legacy costs. That number was projected to grow to 65 cents on the dollar. That's not a sustainable situation. But more important than the financial situation, are the poor services that are being delivered to the citizens of Detroit. They simply deserve better. If you look at it in terms of public safety, Detroit has been on the top 10 list of the most violent cities in 24 of the last 27 years. Response times for police calls are at 58 minutes versus a national average of 11 minutes. The clearance rate on cases is 8.7%. Then you can go on to fire, EMS, streetlights, the list goes on. This is not viable nor appropriate for the citizens of the city. What will federal bankruptcy do for the city? It's an opportunity for a fresh start. It's an opportunity to say, let's make realistic promises to creditors by revising those debts. And more importantly, let's put in place a plan to invest in the city to get improved services to citizens. That's critically important and something they deserve. What does it mean to the state of Michigan? The state of Michigan is the comeback state. But for Michigan to be a great state again, it can only happen if Detroit's on the path to being a great city. This is a critical step in making that happen. Let's move forward and get this done together.
Now, one of the things I'd like you to think about as you leave this class is Governor Snyder was kind of lauded for his political courage in backing the bankruptcy of the city of Detroit, finally taking the bull by the horns. And I think there is some truth to that. But one of the things that he said that was interesting, he said, there are no viable alternatives to bankruptcy. And I think people should think about that because legislatures are fabulously creative places. And I'm like thinking, what? There's no viable alternatives to bankruptcy for the city of Detroit. There's nothing else that can be done. I think that deserves some scrutiny. So we're back to this question of strategy. What is your strategy if you are the city? How are you going to get this through? What's your strategy if you are a pensioner? What is your strategy if you're a financial creditor? Okay. Now, I will say, I think the city underwent a titanic shift in strategy. I think as far as I can tell, when the city started the case, it had no discernible strategy. It was just going to hammer all of the creditors and tell them, we have $30 million a year for you, which is basically the same as saying we have zero. So we have nothing for you. We're going to improve this city. You'll take it and like it. I'm not sure how they thought they were going to get that plan through. I'm not sure who was going to vote in favor of a plan that just said, here's my middle finger. But that appeared to be what their strategy was. And I think in part that was their strategy because they viewed it as a necessity. They viewed the city as in dire need of assistance, and they wanted to put all the money towards that, which is what their proposal to creditors said. Now, we'll come back to the pensioner strategy in a second, but as a financial creditor, our strategy is mainly to say, hey, if you don't take care of us, you'll never be able to borrow money again. Okay. Your credibility as a municipality rides on how you treat us. So if you don't take care of us, you'll never borrow money again. It's the worst argument in the world. Okay. Because everybody knows, no, we're going to borrow money again and you'll lend it to us. We've been through these cycles before. You guys always say that if we don't pay you back, you'll never lend us again. And then you lend us money again. You can't help yourselves. But it was the only argument that we had. So we had to ride this issue of financial credibility. Now, look what the pensioners did. I couldn't figure out. I would go to court. You know, the first thing the pensioners said was, you know, their first argument was no. Okay, I always like that argument. No, we're not going to accept a reduction in our pension. It's protected by the Michigan Constitution. No, we will contribute nothing. Make the banks pay. And then see, there's the pig with the top hat on. So that's my client. Now, what was more interesting was this part. This is the part I couldn't figure out when I first went to court. Our pension is 96.1% funded. If you use those higher rates of return that they had been using, their pensions were relatively funded. Don't forget, Detroit is a union town. Okay, so you fund your pensions, unlike the city of Chicago, where pensions are way worse than underfunded. Our pensions are funded at about 40%. The city of Chicago is almost certainly insolvent. Detroit's pensions were well funded. It was a question of how well funded, but I couldn't figure out, why are the pensioners saying that their pensions are well funded? And I thought that they would want to say they were as unfunded as they could, because that would make their claim bigger. And the bigger your claim, if you're going to get 10 cents on the dollar, you'd rather that your claim was $10 billion instead of $1 billion. So why are they saying their claim is small? The pensioners are making a political gamble. And what they're saying is, I think my pension is going to live through the bankruptcy in some form. Okay, so I think I've got a pension now, and they're going to go through the bankruptcy and they're going to chop me or adjust my pension, but I'll still have a pension on the backside. So my strategy will be to say, our pensions are basically fully funded. So if you want to cut us a little tiny bit during the bankruptcy, that's great. Go ahead, but we're so well funded, you should just cut us a little bit. And then we'll get through the bankruptcy. And whether we're funded or not, we'll figure out that later once we've gotten through bankruptcy. If it turns out, oh, right after the bankruptcy, maybe I'll pop up and say, you know, actually, it's so embarrassing. I know you only cut us 1%. We've rerun the numbers, and it turns out we're super underfunded. You have to put hundreds of millions of dollars into us again in order to make good. That's a good strategy. That is exactly what they did. Okay, so they start the bankruptcy by saying, we're super well funded. Like, you should just cut us a tiny little bit because we're largely good. And then I'll tell you the story about what happens at the end of the bankruptcy, which is also, in my opinion, totally hilarious and was obvious. But the pensioners decide their core strategies are going to fight eligibility. So they're going to get this bankruptcy case dismissed, because if you fall out of federal bankruptcy, you're back under Michigan state law. And what does the Michigan state constitution say? You cannot impair or limit pensions. So I've got to get away from this federal court, and I've got to get back to the world of state law. So I got to dismiss this bankruptcy. So they decide to fight eligibility. And here's how they fight. First, they say the city did not negotiate in good faith. Kevin Orr came, he made that presentation. There was no haggling. He just said, take it or leave it, on this messed up thing that said everybody gets 10 cents on the dollar, everybody gets treated the same. That's not negotiating. So they didn't negotiate in good faith. And second, this was the more clever one. They said, look, you have to be validly authorized to file for bankruptcy by a governmental officer. You remember that provision from the statute we looked at? And the governmental officer that authorized you is the governor. But the governor took an oath to uphold the Michigan Constitution. And the Michigan Constitution says you can't impair or limit pensions. So that means he can't validly authorize bankruptcy consistent with the Michigan Constitution unless he says that any bankruptcy can't impair or limit pensions. So you're finding a way to daisy chain the Michigan Constitution into the eligibility statute. You're saying your authorization under state law must bring with it this precept that pensions can't be touched. So the only bankruptcies you can have in Michigan, according to the unions, were ones that don't reduce the pensions. So this was like a home run ball type argument. And what I like to say in the law is this is a type of argument that proves too much, right? Because you're basically saying, okay, so if pension liability is a problem and you need to file for bankruptcy, but the only bankruptcies you can file for are ones that don't address your pension liability, you're kind of frustrating the statute. And Judge Rhodes, the bankruptcy judge overseeing the case, rejects this. So they have a multi-week trial. And in December of 2013, about 5 months after the city filed, Judge Rhodes finds that the city is eligible. And what he says is, he says, you know, the city did not negotiate in good faith. Like the take it or leave it offer was no good. Kevin Orr didn't do a good job negotiating with people, but it doesn't matter because it was impracticable. They have all these thousands of pensioners and retirees, and the sheer size of the debt and the number of individual creditors made it impracticable. He said it made it impossible. So you didn't have to negotiate in good faith. And he also said that PA 436, which is the statute authorizing bankruptcy, and the idea that the governor had to incorporate the Michigan Constitution into his authorization, that didn't work. He said, look, you can't use state law to modify Chapter 9. It follows that if a state consents to a municipal bankruptcy, which Michigan did with PA 436, no state law can protect contractual pension rights from impairment in bankruptcy. This is a very interesting decision that Rhodes made at the beginning part of the case. It was when I think he was feeling very courageous. He sent a message that pensions can be adjusted. He didn't necessarily have to address that question in this opinion, but he did. He went out of his way to do that. And that was like a big artillery round going over the bow of the unions. Okay. This was the most important part of his opinion to me, which is Rhodes, when he was talking about insolvency, a bankruptcy lawyer like myself thinks of insolvency in terms of your ability to pay debts. Rhodes introduces the idea of service delivery insolvency. He says service delivery insolvency focuses on the municipality's ability to pay for all costs of providing services at the level and quality that are required for the health, safety, and welfare of the community. Okay, required. Indeed, while the city's tumbling credit rating, its utter lack of liquidity, and the disastrous cops and swaps deal might more neatly establish the city's insolvency, he's saying, yeah, that shows we can't pay for stuff. It is the city's service delivery insolvency that the court finds most strikingly disturbing in this case. This is very important because what Rhodes was saying to Orr is he's saying this idea that you can invest in the city and improve it is a legitimate idea. And in fact, I'm finding that your service delivery insolvent. So there's some standard in my mind of what is an appropriate level of services for the city of Detroit, and you're below it. So you have to first get up to that level in order to become solvent again. This was a green light to reinvest in the city. And I think it's also a bit of a dangerous concept. Like, what are the level of services that are required? Is it fire and EMT get to your house in 1 minute, or 3 or 5, 10, 9? Is it the national average? Is it the urban average? Like, how are we deciding what the required level of services are? Who knows? When do we know that we've done enough to invest in our city to provide services? With financial insolvency, I know if I'm solvent or not. A bunch of bills come in. If I can pay them, I'm solvent. Service delivery insolvency, much spongier concept, right? But it's opening up a pathway for Orr to invest in the city. I feel like this did not get enough commentary during the case, and I thought it was the most interesting part. Okay, so you tried to knock them out of bankruptcy, and that didn't work if you're the unions. And if you're the financial creditors like me, everybody hates you anyway. So what are you going to do? The city showed you in its presentation, it's got $30 million a year. They also had this part of the presentation that was like, we have Joe Louis Arena, nobody wants that. We have Cobo Hall, nobody wants that. We have Coleman, Major Coleman Young's airport. It's shuttered. It's going to take a bunch of money. Nobody wants to fly into Detroit. We have no property for you, but we do have this art. So everybody pivoted as one to the art and said, sweet, sell the multi-billion-dollar art collection and then give us some money. And a very important part of the process, the most important part of the process, was that Rhodes decided to appoint a mediation team to help generate a plan of adjustment. The mediation team was led by a man named Gerald Rosen. Gerald Rosen was the chief judge of the Eastern District of Michigan. Okay, so the bankruptcy court you can think of as like a special court that sits below the federal district court. It ultimately is appealed to the federal district court. Judge Rosen was the chief judge of the Eastern District of Michigan, the federal district court in Detroit. And let me just say, it's a little bit unusual to have the mediator, who is supposed to be this impartial person that's helping people resolve their disputes, be kind of like the bankruptcy court's dad. Because if you're saying, well, the bankruptcy judge is making these rulings and these are ridiculous, and then the chief judge of the court that you appeal those rulings to says, I don't think they're that ridiculous, you're kind of like talking to one of the people that will decide. So that's a difficult position to be in. Now, I think Rosen was looking at the city just kind of floundering around. It had won its eligibility trial, but it hadn't performed that well in it. The judge had found that the city didn't negotiate in good faith. The city has no friends. At Kirkland, we like to say, when you go into bankruptcy, you got to make sure you go in with a friend, and you find one creditor who's your friend. And so when you get up and say something, somebody that's suffering gets up and says, I agree with Steve. The city had no friends. I think Rosen decided they needed a strategy. And so here's what he decided.
Through its research and convenings, the Center on Philanthropy and Public Policy seeks to make philanthropy more impactful today and to create a smarter, stronger sector for tomorrow.
Kevin Orr, the emergency manager for the city of Detroit, filed for bankruptcy protection under Chapter 9 in the federal court on July 18th, 2013. It was the largest and is the largest municipal bankruptcy in U.S. history. The bankruptcy was just the latest episode in the spiraling decline of an iconic American city that had been decades in the making. Simply put, the grand bargain was the imagination of Judge Rosen, who found collaborators in Detroit's philanthropic community and the philanthropic community connected to Detroit.
What does a mediator do? A mediator takes resources and distributes the resources, hopefully through consensual agreements, to creditors. There was no revenue stream available, and there were no assets that could be monetized into revenue other than the art collection. And I said I wasn't getting anywhere with the governor, so I was hoping that foundations could kickstart the funding. You know, if the foundations do decide to participate in this, we're going to need participation from other stakeholders, particularly the state. Now, I'd had many conversations with the governor and his staff about state participation, and they were not encouraging at all. But I also knew that if we could put enough money together from the foundations in this assetless bankruptcy and make this pool of money from philanthropy conditional upon the state's participation, that I could kind of leverage that with the governor. And Ford is prepared to make the largest commitment in its history. And we got up to $291 million with about 4 foundations or 5 foundations.
You have to essentially frame this as the only way to resolve the bankruptcy and to permit us to get on with the process of city building. You essentially are saying you can't do any of the work that you hope to do in the city of Detroit unless the bankruptcy is resolved. I was on the phone to all of our smaller foundations, not a single one was in. And I kept saying, you know, what will it take? What can we provide? And what it took was an analysis of the conditions of engagement.
I think we haven't talked about the risk that we also created for philanthropy, which is the expectation that it's the role of private philanthropy to solve these huge public problems, because it's not the role of foundations to solve the fact that a city has committed a grave malfeasance over decades. It is in our interest to have a fully capacitated, high-functioning municipal government.
I want you to remember what he said. He's the head of the Ford Foundation. And what I think happened here is Judge Rosen, the chief mediator, and the chief judge of the Eastern District, I think he looked at this situation, he saw the city just kind of floundering around, and he said, we need a strategy. Our strategy is going to be, we're going to take the art, I'm going to go to a bunch of foundations, and I'm going to get them to give us money. I'm going to condition that money on the state of Michigan giving us money and the Detroit Institute of Art giving us money. And we're going to use that money and we're going to give it all to the pensioners. And so we'll give it to the pensioners because I think they concluded they just were not going to be able to make meaningful cuts to the pensions without people completely freaking out. So they decided we're going to buy our friend. Now, don't forget remember when we started in the first class, we were talking about the key principles of bankruptcy. One of the key principles is you cannot unfairly discriminate against creditors. And it's designed to protect against exactly the situation where you take all the dough and you give it to your one buddy, and then your one buddy says, I love this plan, and votes in favor of it. That's what Jerry Rosen decided to do. Okay. So what happens is The foundations agree to put in 366 million over 20 years. The DIA raises 100 million that it will put in over 20 years. And then both groups condition that on the state passing legislation to put in $350 million over, I think, 10 years. And all of this will go into the pension system to relieve the city of its obligations. So they create a 10-year holiday for the city where it will not have to make pension contributions because these folks are going to step in. The present value, remember, these amounts are over time. So if you're going to give me $366 million over 20 years, that's worth like, I don't know, 160 million if you just gave it to me in a lump sum up front. Okay, so the numbers, they presented the numbers this way because they always like to say that the grand bargain was $820 million. The present value of the grand bargain was around $500 million. Remember, we were saying the art was worth between $2 and $5 billion. So as a financial creditor, this is a disaster because first of all, you're only getting about 25 cents on the dollar for this asset, even if the low range of the valuation is correct. And I always thought the high range was probably closer. And second, you're giving it all to these guys. Like, what about me? Where do I factor in? I'm an unsecured creditor. I'm owed money as well. So it was tough to watch this because this is all before the confirmation trial and Jerry Rosen is going around and they're having all these speeches at the DIA and with the governor at the state house and everyone's like celebrating and the case isn't over yet. But I think Jerry Rosen was like, oh, the case is over. The only people that don't know the case is over are you. And you'll find that out in about 4 months when the case finally ends. But this is what you have to remember. The grand bargain, a multi-part contribution by private foundations, the Detroit Institute of Art, the state of Michigan. Detroit gets a 10-year holiday on the pensions and all the money goes to the pensioners. So I immediately said, well, I'm going to have to subpoena those foundations because apparently what you're saying is that they'll only put the money in if it all goes to the pensioners. And I haven't heard anyone say that. I've heard you say that. I haven't heard these foundations say that. I've heard about them talking about protecting the art. And protecting the art is great. If they want to put money in to protect the art, that's fine. We can all share that money. But now you're saying, no, they'll only put the money in if it goes to the pensioners. I want to see the documents on that. So I issued subpoenas to all the foundations, which was not the funnest day of my life. And the judge quashed those subpoenas. The judge was not happy with me for subpoenaing all these good Samaritans who were just coming up to give money to the pensioners. When Fidget said, hey, before we decide that this is so great, why don't we do a complete valuation of the art collection? Kevin Orr has studiously refused to value the entire art collection. The judge stopped that too. So the judge said, no, I think we're good with the stated value of the art that we got from Kevin. Okay, so they're blocking our ability to test. Is this deal as good? Is it so grand? Is this bargain so grand? They're not letting us explore it because they do not want these questions answered. Okay, so the city now takes the grand bargain and it makes it the centerpiece of its plan of adjustment. So remember when we talked about those reinvestment initiatives that Kevin presented in his proposal to creditors? That's in there. They're going to invest $500 million in blight. They're going to buy new police cars, lots of stuff that the people of the city needed. It was $1.5 billion over 10 years, about $150 million a year. The plan calls for all the grand bargain proceeds to go to the pensioners and mandates a 4.5% reduction for general retirees pensions and 0% for police and fire. Both of them give up their cost of living adjustment, which is meaningful. I don't want to underscore that, but this is important. The city was basically deciding we're not going to wallop the pensions. We're just not going to do it. So all that tough talk at the beginning of the bankruptcy about shared sacrifice and how pensions can be adjusted and how we've got to invest in the city, they lost the courage of their convictions at the end and they decided we just can't do it to these people. It's too painful for them and for us. We're just not going to do it. They did cut their general obligation bonds 28%. So that was considered very controversial at the time. General obligation bonds had always recovered 100 cents on the dollar in other cases. they made a meaningful haircut. So they basically said general obligation bonds are not the gold standard of municipal finance they've been held out to be. You can adjust them. And then they crushed the rest of us. Okay. Now, before I'm too hard on the pensioners, I do want to point out that they wipe out OPEB. Okay, so those healthcare benefits get completely eliminated. That $5.7 billion in healthcare benefits, that got annihilated. And I couldn't figure out why that wasn't a bigger deal in the bankruptcy. And what I finally decided was, I think so many of the retirees are eligible for Medicare that they were like, it's fine. And this is also a time where the Affordable Care Act has now been passed. So you have access to healthcare. So for whatever reason, that $5.7 billion in healthcare benefits that was taken away was not a flashpoint in the case as much as I thought it would be, because I thought people would be really upset by that. But I do want to tip my cap to these retirees. They gave up that healthcare benefit they negotiated almost entirety. So you can think of them as largely keeping their pensions, but giving up their healthcare. You can think of us as getting absolutely destroyed. Okay, so the city admitted, hey, this is their plan of adjustment. This is their statement of who's getting what. And they admitted major discrimination. Okay, so I had a real discrimination case. This is me. This is them. Who would you rather be, me or them? Okay, they're getting a 6 times recovery. So we say, hey, this plan is patently unconfirmable. It doesn't work. It's great that everybody voted in favor of it other than us. Of course they voted in favor of it. You're giving them all this stuff. So we said this discriminates unfairly. And we made an argument that said, hey, you are giving us so little, we could recover more if we were outside of bankruptcy. And this was our argument at trial, that the city had just taken this grand bargain, put it into the center of its plan, and not considered enough alternatives.
Rhodes has been asked to stop Detroit's bankruptcy trial just as day 2 begins. It's because of testimony from Detroit Emergency Manager Kevin Orr. 7 Action News reporter Jim Kirshner is live downtown right now with more on this development. Jim, what's going on?
Emergency Manager Kevin Orr gave a video deposition, part of which was played here in court, and in it he said the grand bargain was designed to help 23,000 retirees. It is sympathy, but attorneys for Syncora, a Wall Street creditor which stands to lose hundreds of millions of dollars here, says sympathy is no part of bankruptcy, but discrimination is.
You have to have an evidentiary basis to discriminate. You can't just discriminate because you like to or because you have sympathy for the pensioners. And I'm sure everyone has sympathy for the pensioners.
It's not just the word of Kevin Orr, but also 2 hired experts for the city who testified Detroit has made no contingency, no dismissal plan to pay creditors if its plan of adjustment is not approved by Judge Stephen Rhodes. Key to that, the so-called grand bargain, $816 million from foundations and the state to save the collection from being sold at the Detroit Institute of Arts and to soften pension cuts. Creditor attorneys told Judge Rhodes the city dropped a big mess on his doorstep, cut corners, and throws themselves on the mercy of the courts. They said Detroit has chutzpah trying to get through court. The judge called those powerful arguments.
There are alternative plans here that could be better, not only for the city, but also for all of the creditors, better for everyone. And our view is that those have not been adequately explored or diligenced. The city, you'll hear testimony this afternoon. The grand bargain was it. They didn't even look at any alternatives.
Now, obviously, the trial was not stopped. In fact, opening statements continue into day 3 here tomorrow. I'm live downtown, Jim Kirshner, 7 Action News.
Now, I will say one thing, and I know I'm coming to the end of our time here, but the one thing I'll say is that our opening statement was devastating. And I could see Rhodes go ashen-faced during our opening statement because we were basically saying, come on, this plan is not close to being confirmable. Like, we should go back to the drawing board. There was not going to be any going back to the drawing board. Okay, so what we realized on behalf of Syncora and the financial creditors, we needed to cut the best deal we could and then get the hell out of the city of Detroit. And so that's what we did. So we were the last impediment to fighting this case. And so when we settled, it was a big deal.
There has been a major breakthrough in Detroit's bankruptcy case tonight. Syncora, which has opposed the city's plan of adjustment, has finally made a deal with the city. 7 Action News reporter Jim Kirchner joins us now live from downtown Detroit with the terms of the deal. Jim, this is huge.
It is, but sources also tell me tonight, Malcolm, that this is a tentative deal, still needs approval from 2 banks with whom Syncora, this Wall Street entity, does business. But take a look at the terms with the city of Detroit tonight. Syncora will go from about 10 cents on the dollar to 20 cents on the dollar. It'll get $23.5 million in cash up front from a bond the city is selling for $120 million, already part of the plan of adjustment. Syncora gets a stake in the Detroit-Windsor Tunnel, prime property, and parking operations. Syncora is the toughest opponent in the bankruptcy trial for several reasons.
That unfair discrimination is just one part of the case. The city also has to show that the plan is in the best interest of creditors, meaning that we do better under the plan than we would if there were no plan, and that the plan is fair and equitable.
The discrimination claim was over the grand bargain designed to save the art at the Detroit Institute from being sold to satisfy creditors. Syncora was not getting a dime but claimed the art was worth billions. The deal will also soften pension cuts to 23,000 Detroit retirees. Sources tonight confirmed to 7 Action News. Syncora will also get a long-term lease agreement to operate the underground parking at Grand Circus Park,
Of like a parking
prime
garage in the middle
location
of
next to
Detroit.
Comerica Park and Ford Field. Syncora must make $13 million in improvements, but will be guaranteed a minimum $21.6 million and share the revenue with the city 75-25. Syncora also has its eye on development of prime downtown riverfront property, including Ford Auditorium and Joe Louis Arena after the Red Wings move to a new arena in Foxtown. The city gives Syncora a $6 million coupon. City is also extending a lease with Syncora, a subsidiary, from 2020 to 2040 on the Detroit side of the Windsor Tunnel, estimated to be worth about $4 to $5 million a year. The settlement was reached in closed mediation in federal court. No comment publicly.
You know, I can't comment on any of that, but as you see, I'm in the courtroom every day, and so is Mr. Kieselstein, so we're banging away on the assumption that we're going to take this case to the wall.
Now tonight in a court filing, Syncora said it wants 48 hours to finalize these details and will discuss them first thing in the morning here in court with Judge Stephen Rhodes. The judge could pause this now for a couple of days, but there's still another major Wall Street player in this case, Financial Guarantee, another bond insurer, but still fighting the city. I'm live downtown, Jim Kirchner, 7 Action News.
Thanks, Jim. And
So we settled, and that brought the case largely to an end. There were just some cats and dogs objectors. Rhodes still had to write an opinion. And what he said was the discrimination that is occurring is not unfair because of the circumstances of the city's Chapter 9 case, the purpose of Chapter 9, which is to adjust an insolvent municipality's debt so that it can provide adequate municipal services, and the court's conscience. So I had gotten Rhodes to admit on the record that sympathy towards the pensioners was not a legally cognizable basis to give them more money. But in his opinion, he said the court's conscience is actually apparently part of the legal standard. So if my conscience dictates that I'm going to give it all to my friends, then I'm allowed to give it all to my friends. The main argument here was that if you jilt the pensioners, you will impact the morale of your current employees who will fear that you will jilt them later. I never accepted that argument because if I was a current employee, every dollar going out the door to some retiree is putting my pension more at risk. So I always thought there was a tension between the current employees and the retirees. But that's what Rhodes said in his opinion. And he also justified best interests. He said if this case were dismissed, it would be a mess outside of bankruptcy and you wouldn't really recover anything. You know, I've got to work on my timing because the way I had this booked, I was going to leave a full 30 minutes for a discussion. But the number one question that I would like you to think about is, were there alternatives to bankruptcy that the state of Michigan should have considered? I'm an East Lansing product. I grew up right down the street from Detroit. But I left the state of Michigan and never came back because right down the road is the city of Chicago, a massive, vibrant economic center. Michigan doesn't have that. And when they approached this as a bankruptcy, in my opinion, They kind of treated Detroit as almost like a nuclear waste site that needed to be limited and remedied. But are there alternative universes where the state gets together and says, let's invest in the city? Let's build a pathway to truly revitalize this city. Was Governor Snyder right when he said there were no viable alternatives? Was it fair to pay the pensioners more? They're very sympathetic. There are stories that even in this room of people that have lost pensions and understand what it means at a personal level. That's a pretty serious point. And financial creditors like me, we're not the same as pensioners, right? Like Syncora is going to be Syncora, but all those tens of thousands of people that might lose their pension, that's real hardship. Should the city have been forced to sell all of its art collection, or should it have done what it did and kind of keep the art collection, try to get some money in for it? And last, what do you think about the emergency manager law? Is it a good thing? Is it a necessity, or is it an affront to democracy? Thank you very much for giving me your attention and coming out on this incredibly cold day. It's been a wonderful thing to do and come and sit with you all and talk about this case. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve, for spending the time to prepare for these two classes.